What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the minimally edited, extended cut podcast version of this week's episode. Today, we're going to talk about what to do if you're just feeling completely stuck when it comes to launching your private practice. I'm talking to those of you who have decided I'm starting my private practice. You've set a timeline. I'm going to do it in this amount of months, and then I'm going to do this, that, and the other, and I'm going to be launched, and that time goes by, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't happened yet. If this is you, I see this all the time, so you're not alone. And honestly, I think this is just a really normal part of the process. When I see this come up, it seems like there's a few kind of common patterns that pop up. So I'm going to point out some of the patterns that I often see happen for folks when they're getting stuck starting their private practice and offer a few tips to help you get unstuck, because I want you to get going just as much as you want to get going. Also, before I dive into the topic of this week's episode, I really wanted to pause and just say thank you for how kind and supportive you all were. After last week's episode, it was a heavy-hitting topic. I'm not going to kind of reopen all the heavy stuff today, but I touched on some heavy aspects of my own life experience, and I waited to share until I felt ready to kind of cope with whatever kind of reaction people might have when I shared. But it's so nice to have such a supportive response, of course, as well. So thank you to all of you who left comments on that episode saying you felt encouraged, or maybe you unfortunately related, but that you found something supportive from that episode. I'm so glad to hear that. So thank you again for that. We're going to carry on with today's content now, but I just wanted to pause and acknowledge that. We've all been there before, right? Where you have a goal in mind in life, you have a plan, hopefully, for how it's gonna unfold, and you're like motivated, you're ready, it's happening. Today's the day, now's the time. And then time passes and it just doesn't happen. I'm thinking of New Year's resolutions as like a classic textbook scenario of that, but it can happen with anything that we set our minds to in life, that we just find ourselves dropping the ball. And of course, this kind of phenomenon is a just completely human pattern. And I think when it comes to launching a business as a private practice owner, it can have its own specific set of patterns that tend to come up. So let's talk about some of the things that I often see happen for folks who get stuck along the way when it comes to starting a private practice. And I'm going to offer some solutions I think that might be helpful for you. For a lot of us, when we set our minds to a goal and we find that it's not happening, we're getting stuck, we treat it with attempts at practical solutions. And that makes sense. We say, you're stuck. What do you need? What's the next step maybe for starting your private practice? Oh, you're stuck on creating your website. Okay, let's make a website then. How do we make a website? Step 1, 2, and 3, let's go. And we'll tell ourselves these sort of practical tips to keep moving forward, but it still just doesn't happen, even if it's kind of quote unquote the right next step. So to me, when I hear that somebody is feeling stuck when it comes to starting their private practice, it's super important to first identify what kind of category of stuck you're in. Because certainly if you're having a practical problem, like you don't really know what the next step is, then the solution is a practical one. Here's your next step, do this. But a lot of times, the problem is not a practical problem, and we try to treat it with a practical solution, which any of you who've ever done couples counseling before, or, been in a relationship with a person knows that trying to fix a problem that's emotional or something else with a practical solution is just a recipe for disaster most of the time. So that's actually my primary tip in this video, if you take nothing else away, is find a way to identify what the actual category of problem is that's causing you to be stuck. For example, if you think of starting a private practice like driving somewhere in your car and you find yourself getting lost along the way, rather than saying like, well, let's just keep retyping the address into GPS and following the GPS. If you've already tried that a few times and you still haven't gotten to your destination, then there's a good chance there's something else going on keeping you from getting to where you're going. It's not just a matter of like re-entering it back into GPS and following directions. Like for all we know, maybe you're actually just pulled over on the side of the road crying because you're having a really hard day and it doesn't matter what GPS is telling you to do. You are not going anywhere today. That would be really helpful to notice that and nurture and take care of that before we say, okay, you ready? to go back to where GPS is telling us to go next. So that's kind of the idea I want to get at with today's episode. Identify the category of stuck that you're in if you've been stuck. And yeah, if you've been trying to treat the problem with more practical solutions and it hasn't been getting you where you want to go, then there's a good chance that there's something else that's causing that block for you. So some of the other potential reasons why somebody might be stuck when it comes to starting a private practice include emotional reasons, a lack of support, a lack of financial access, or maybe it's just bad timing, like this is something that's going to be right in the future, but not yet today. Now, out of those variables, if it really is a practical snag that you're hitting, meaning, you don't have the GPS coordinates to get to where you're going, fortunately, there are just so many tools available today. I like to think that I offer some of them, but even if it's not through my tools, and even if it's not through your graduate training, I know there is so much access available today to tell you what the next steps are to get started in private practice. If you don't know where to go and you're just completely lost on the practical front, I recommend my free checklist with every single step you need to get started in private practice. I have it linked below in pretty much every video that I post. You can go ahead and download that, run through the checklist, see if there's anywhere that you're getting stuck, and then you can get more tools related to that specific arena if you need to. But if somehow you already have the practical tools to get to where you need to go, maybe you signed up for some sort of program and it's like you have everything plugged into GPS and you know exactly what the next steps are, but you're still getting stuck, I found that most of the time, it tends to be an emotional issue creating a roadblock. I think because there is so much practical information available as far as what steps to take to start a private practice, the emotional piece can often be overlooked, and for a lot of us, that is the primary barrier keeping us from getting started. So I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of this video talking about some of those common emotional roadblocks and offer some tools to help you move through them. Bring them with you, but let's keep going forward. You know what I mean? So one of the most common emotional roadblocks is imposter syndrome, or it could also be referred to as self-doubt. Now, this one is one that I think folks are kind of more on board with now. It's kind of trendy to talk about imposter syndrome. It's really that sensation of like, can I really do this? Am I qualified to be in private practice? I remember for me, this was a really loud one when I got started in private practice. I was 25 and I thought, am I allowed to be in private practice as a 25-year-old? Am I too young? Am I qualified enough? Do I have enough experience as a therapist to do this? And all that self-doubt really made it a lot harder for me to just go ahead and do the thing that I wanted to do. That was the packaging that the imposter syndrome took for me when I was getting started in my mid-20s, but it can take many forms. I've heard it in every variation of the story. I've heard people say things like, am I too old for private practice? Like, well, which one is it? And you can only do it at this very specific age in life. But it's funny how our mind can sort of create a story where we feel like we're not qualified, we're an imposter. And of course, make sure you have all the appropriate qualifications to work with therapy clients. But most of the time when it's coming up for us, it's like we have all the qualifications and then some, but we're just second guessing ourselves. So if somehow imposter syndrome or self-doubt is kind of the primary barrier keeping you from getting to your goal of starting a private practice, this one's a really good one to reach out to social support, maybe even get some practical reassurance from people who are doing the thing that you want to be doing to say, hey, am I qualified enough for this? Or whatever the packaging that your self-doubt is arriving in, to sort of check in with somebody who would have enough knowledge about that to be able to say like, oh, don't even worry about that. You're totally fine, because that's most likely going to be their answer. That's definitely something that's helped me, not just at the beginning with starting private practice, but like to this day, it's just a continuous process that I assume that if I'm kind of stretching myself, I'm setting goals that are kind of challenging myself, that I'm going to experience some amount of self-doubt, and reaching out to somebody who's qualified to do like a reality check and offer reassurance if that's what's accurate really helps me get through it and keep moving towards my goals. Another category of emotional barrier that I see happen to folks that keeps them from starting their private practice is overwhelm. And this one I completely understand, because there genuinely are so many steps when it comes to starting a private practice. I wish it was like a 3-step process, and it's definitely not. Fortunately, a lot of the steps are in the category of like kind of paper pushing almost. Like you just have to actually complete a piece of paper or an online form. So it's just kind of tedious work that we're all capable of doing. But I know how it feels when you see all the steps laid out on a piece of paper or in a PDF, like my free guide. You can see that maybe there's like 40 steps and it feels completely overwhelming. And it's really easy for a lot of folks to get caught up in that and then not see that they can definitely do the step that's the next one. Just what's the next step? Do that. Don't worry about the other steps until you get there. So I think I already touched on the potential piece of advice for how to overcome overwhelm if it's holding you back from starting private practice is, can you make the steps any smaller, or can you just focus on one step at a time? If one step in and of itself already feels overwhelming, that probably means there's a whole bunch of steps within that step as well. I mean, I poke at this one because this is what I teach on, so that's why I talk about it so much, but let's say the step of starting a website. It's one step on my checklist of stuff to do to start your private practice, but let's be honest, starting a website is a gazillion steps within that step. So if there's a step that you're facing that feels overwhelming, that tells me that probably there's a whole bunch of steps within that one step. See if there's anything you can access to help you break down that step into a bunch of smaller steps and then focus on the next step. So with starting a website, it might be like, okay, what do I want to call my website? Maybe we'll start there. And if that feels overwhelming, you can start with something else too. Just make the steps as small as you can in order to be able to manage them. The other steps will still be there and eventually you'll get there. But, if let's say you're walking a mile and you realize however many, thousands of steps are involved in walking a mile and you think like, oh no, I don't know how many steps are in a mile. What is it, like 3,000? I'm not sure. I'm just guessing. Let's say it's 3,000 steps to walk a mile and you think like, oh my gosh, I have to walk 3,000 steps. I'm not going to be able to do it. And what if I get to, step 1,000 and I'm too tired and I can't keep going and then I won't even make it to the mile and then I'm going to be just hard on myself because I didn't get it done. And so sometimes it's just easier to not even start, right? But if you think of it as like, yeah, it's 3,000 steps, but I know I can at least do one step. Let me put one foot forward and see how that goes. And then I'll put another foot forward. And if I make it to 3,000, great. That was kind of a silly example because most people on average, I think, are not overwhelmed at the prospect of walking 3,000 steps, but that was the example that came. So that's the one you got. Another common emotional roadblock that I see that kind of keeps people back from starting their private practice is a values disconnect. So maybe you know all the right steps to take. Maybe you feel like you're qualified, you're not dealing with self-doubt, and maybe you don't even find it particularly overwhelming, but you're disconnected with the reason for why you're doing this. So the values disconnect is about the why. Like, why am I pursuing private practice? And that's an important question to have the answer to for sure before you dive into, any major venture. The bigger the venture, the more rooted in the why we need to be in order to have that sort of intrinsic motivation that's needed to make that outcome happen. Because yes, starting a private practice is a big venture, so we have to be very well rooted in our why in order to be successful in launching a private practice. So if you're feeling disconnected from your why, then that would be a really good thing to pause and regroup on. Why the heck am I doing this? Why am I pursuing private practice? Of course, each person has their own individual why for why they're choosing private practice, but it's very important to identify what that is and make sure you're constantly coming back to this so that when you hit a snag, when you have a task that looks hard or boring or you just don't want to do that because you could maybe watch your favorite show on Netflix instead, to say, well, what's my why? If I could get to that goal of starting a private practice, what am I hoping will be different about my life? Is it that I'm going to have a little bit more flexibility in my schedule, that I'm going to be able to step aside from burnout, that maybe I'm going to be able to pay those bills that I haven't been able to save up for, for a long time? Fill in the blank, remind yourself of that and say, okay, so if I can do a little step towards that now, then I'm taking a little step towards this why that is motivating for me. A little sidebar on this one is if you do check in with your why and it's not very clear what your why is, or maybe the why is clear but you don't have ownership of it, like maybe your partner really wants you to be in private practice but you don't have a clear why on it, that's something that's really worth clicking the pause button on and saying, is this what I really want to do? Or is this the right time for me to do this? Because if you're not clear on your why, personally, I think it's going to be really difficult for you to find success in private practice. Whatever it is that we're doing, we have to know why we're doing it. Even if it's something that we don't enjoy, maybe we're doing it because it pays the bills or it offers something that's important to us. And so if you're not clear on your why and it's still not there when you go to look for it, then maybe really ask yourself why. Is this the right time or place? Is this what you actually want? It's okay to ask those questions. Another category of emotional roadblock that I hear from folks is fear. Totally understandable and legitimate, by the way. I'm not going to sit here and say don't worry, don't have any fears. There's absolutely nothing that can go wrong. You're taking on zero risk when you start a private practice. I mean, fears are a natural, normal reaction that our bodies have to say, is this really a good idea? I remember a while back now, years ago, I made a series on this YouTube channel addressing your greatest fears in private practice. And if I'm remembering correctly, the two greatest fears that you all named at the time were that you weren't going to get enough clients and that you weren't going to make enough money in private practice. And assuming you're working at some other job, hopefully at least you're getting a salary or you have a full caseload consistently, even if there's other reasons why maybe you don't want to stay at that place of work. And when you take the plunge into private practice, especially if you haven't started yet, you don't have any evidence to show that you're going to have clients or that you're going to make money. So your fears are reasonable. I'm not trying to fan the fear and make it worse than is necessary, but I also don't want to shut down the fear. So if you are noticing that you're carrying a fear, whether it's one of the ones I named or if it's a different fear, it's okay to set up a system to help test out that fear, right? So if let's say your plan was to quit your agency job and then dive straight into full-time private practice, and your fear is, what if I don't make money right away, or it takes too long for me to make money? Maybe I have 3 months of cushion funds for me to start, but it's going to take me 6 months before it's profitable. That's a legitimate fear. And then the question might be, is there a different path that you want to try taking to make sure you are caring well for that fear that's there? Maybe is it an option for you to go part-time at your agency work and start private practice part-time? Or if it's not an option to do that, do you want to just build up your marketing on the side just bit by bit while you're still at your agency until you see that you have kind of a proven strategy that brings in regular clients? Whatever it might be, it's okay to pivot your path so that your fear is cared for well, because oftentimes fears are very legitimate. And if you're looking into your fears and it does seem like the fear is overblown, then of course, we're therapists. We know how to seek support to help us care for our fears, whether it looks like going to see your own personal therapist or just seeking support from consult group or reassurances from friends and loved ones who say, don't worry about that, right? Especially if the fear is something like, I'm worried that I'm going to let my partner down if this doesn't go the way that I want it to go. That's a great thing to talk to your partner about before you dive in. Whatever your fears are, it's important to acknowledge them and support them in whatever ways are called for given what's coming up with your fears. Obviously, emotional roadblocks can take many other forms other than these, but these just seem to be the categories of emotional roadblocks that I see come up most frequently when I'm talking to therapists who are feeling a bit stuck when it comes to starting a private practice. So hopefully hearing me just name them out loud can start to get your little brain juices flowing around where you might be getting stuck. Or even if you're not feeling stuck per se, a lot of us have these kind of semi-roadblocks, meaning we're still moving towards our goals, but at least for me, when I have a lot of these snags happening in my life, I'll feel guilt or shame. maybe the timeline is just going a little bit more slowly than I initially planned, even if I'm still working towards the goal. And I could be really hard on myself for saying I set this timeline and it's not going the way that I'd planned. But maybe there's actually these very legitimate emotional pieces happening behind the scenes that maybe I'm still carrying forward despite their presence. But it's helpful to just acknowledge, like, I see you, emotional roadblocks. You've been dragging me back, right? There's a weight kind of pulling at the back of our shirt saying, you are not going to go to your goal as quickly as you wanted. And maybe it's just fine that, we're getting to our goal slower, or, we were planning to kind of reach sky high and go for this big goal. And instead we, got to 80% of that goal, and that's still a win. So it could be helpful to acknowledge some of these emotional roadblocks, even if we are moving towards our goals, or maybe we've already been in private practice for a long time, or whatever it might be. So I hope you found encouragement from these. And if there's some other category of roadblock going on, timing, funding, whatever it is, then it's helpful to identify what that roadblock is and address it appropriately. And whatever kind of roadblocks you might be coming up against, I think it's so valuable to find support no matter what, whether it comes from a loved one who's not a therapist, whether it comes from a peer consult group, or, if it makes sense to pursue your own personal therapy. Whatever you need, it's more than okay and appropriate to seek support, especially when you're diving into a venture like starting your own business. I mean, that's a whole thing. Like, it's okay for it to be a big deal and treat it as such by kind of getting all the supports that you need in order to be successful. Wherever you might be at, whether you're feeling stuck starting your private practice, you haven't started private practice yet, or maybe you've been in private practice for a long time, I hope you feel supported by this episode. I find it so valuable to just call it like it is, or that's how I perceive it, at least, because I get stuck on this kind of stuff all the time, and I just feel supported when other people talk about it. So that's the vibe I'm trying to send your way, and maybe there's some practical tools in here that are helpful to you as well. Well, I'm curious as I finish this video if you thought of any other roadblocks that either you're facing right now, or maybe you faced them in the past that made it difficult for you to accomplish your goals. Feel free to leave it in the comments below if you'd like to share, because I know other people read the comments and find a lot of encouragement there as well. So thank you for caring for each other in the comments. I do appreciate that. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.